Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. All right, so today we're going to be getting into some pretty heavy stuff. Death penalty stuff, capital punishment.
Big questions, right?
Yeah, you gave me this whole stack of articles.
I did.
We got legal arguments. We got moral dilemmas. We even have like perspectives from victims' families.
Yeah, it's a
lot.
It's a lot to think about.
But I think it's going to be really interesting.
It is going to be fascinating to sort of like see where this debate is headed because, you know, globally, there's a lot of change happening in terms of how different societies are approaching justice and punishment.
Well, that's what I think is so interesting is like this group, the Abolition League,
you
know, they're advocating for like completely abolishing the death penalty worldwide.
Wow.
Like, what are their core arguments?
What are they trying to achieve?
Yeah, what are they trying to achieve?
I think one of the things that they bring up that's really powerful is this idea of human rights, you know?
Yeah.
They believe that every single person, no matter what they've done, has a fundamental right to life.
Right.
And that taking a life even as punishment is a violation of that, right?
So basically what they're saying is that the state, no matter how heinous the crime, shouldn't have that power to decide who lives and dies.
Exactly.
That's a pretty bold stance.
It is a bold stance.
Yeah.
And they back it up
with
some pretty compelling arguments.
Like what?
Well, for example, they point to the very real risk of wrongful convictions, you know?
Oh, yeah.
No justice system is perfect.
Of course not.
And the idea of executing an innocent person is just, it's horrifying.
I know. I remember reading about this case a while back where this guy was on death row for like 20 years.
Oh, wow.
And then DNA evidence completely exonerated him.
Wow.
And it's just like, you think about all the people who might have been wrongly executed, and there's no
going back.
There's no going back from that. It's irreversible.
And the Abolition League argues that even one wrongful execution is too many.
Right.
They believe that life in prison without parole is a more just and humane alternative.
So they're not saying that criminals shouldn't be punished.
No.
They're just saying that there's a line.
There's a line we shouldn't cross.
Yeah.
Exactly. They argue that true justice focuses on rehabilitation, not revenge.
Okay.
And that by abolishing the death penalty, we're affirming the value of every human life, even those who have committed terrible crimes.
I'm sure there are people who would like vehemently disagree with that.
Oh, absolutely.
What about like the people who believe that the death penalty is the only fitting punishment for certain crimes?
Right.
You know, what are their reasons for supporting capital punishment?
Yeah, I mean, there are some pretty strong arguments. Yeah, on the other side of this debate.
Right.
One of the most common is this idea of retribution.
Okay.
You know, this belief that the punishment should fit the crime.
Right.
And for some, the death penalty is seen as the only just punishment. Like really heinous crimes like mass murder or acts of terrorism.
I can see how people would feel that way, especially if they've been personally affected,
right,
you know, by violent crime.
Absolutely.
That desire for justice, for some kind of balance, must be like incredibly powerful.
It is incredibly powerful. And then there's also the argument that, you know, the death penalty acts as a deterrent.
Okay.
So it prevents future crimes.
Right.
By, you know, making potential criminals think twice.
Right. I mean, that makes sense logically, but like, is there any evidence to support that?
Yeah.
I mean, do we actually see lower crime rates in places that have the death penalty?
That's where things get a little bit murky.
Okay.
The research on deterrence is actually quite mixed.
Oh, okay.
Some studies suggest a possible deterrent effect, but others find no statistically significant impact on crime rates.
So it's not a clear-cut answer.
Oh, no, not at all. And, you know, there are so many other factors that contribute to crime rates.
Sure.
Socioeconomic conditions.
Of course.
Access to education, mental health support.
Yeah.
That it's almost impossible to isolate the impact of just the death penalty.
So even if there were like a deterrent effect,
kind of brings us back to some of the core arguments against capital punishment.
Okay.
You know, the risk of wrongful convictions, the inherent value of human life, and this question of whether the state should have the ultimate power over life and death.
You know, one of the articles that you gave me that really struck me was the one that focused on like the families of victims and how the death penalty like actually impacts them. Right. Is it really a source of healing and closure, as some people claim?
That's a complex question.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer.
Sure.
While some families may find a sense of justice or closure in seeing the person responsible for their loved one's death executed, For others, it can actually prolong the grieving process.
Oh, wow.
Or even trigger further trauma.
It's almost like even with the execution, the cycle of violence and pain just continues.
Yeah.
There's no real winning in this situation, no matter what happens.
You're absolutely right. And it really highlights the need for a more nuanced and compassionate approach to justice.
Yeah.
One that considers the individual needs of victims and their families and recognizes that punishment alone doesn't necessarily lead to healing or reconciliation.
So if we were to move away from the death penalty, what are the alternatives?
Well,
how do we address these serious crimes and ensure justice without resorting to capital punishment?
There are a number of alternatives that are being explored and implemented around the world.
Like what?
One of the most common is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. So this ensures that the offender is permanently removed from society and can no longer pose a threat.
So that addresses the public safety concern, but what about rehabilitation? Is there any hope for that with a life sentence?
That's a great question. And it's something that more and more prison systems are focusing on. There are programs that offer education, vocational training, therapy, and other opportunities for personal growth and change, even within the confines of prison.
So the focus kind of shifts from pure punishment to the possibility of rehabilitation.
Exactly.
Even for those who have committed, terrible crimes.
Right. And there's also a growing interest in what's called restorative justice approaches, which focus on repairing the harm caused by the crime and bringing together victims, offenders, and the community in a process of dialogue and accountability.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more about how that works? How do you bring together people who have been so deeply affected by violence and try to find some kind of common ground?
It's definitely a complex process, and it doesn't work in every case.
Of course.
But the core principle is that true justice involves more than just punishment. It's about acknowledging the harm that's been done, taking responsibility for one's actions, and finding ways to repair the damage and move forward.
So instead of just locking someone up and throwing away the key, there's an attempt to address the underlying issues, the root causes of the crime, and to find ways to heal and prevent future harm.
Exactly. It's a more holistic approach to justice that recognizes the humanity of everyone involved, even those who have committed terrible acts.
Yeah. We'll be right back to wrap things up. I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip and Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.
Okay, so we've talked about all these arguments for and against, all the ethical dilemmas, the legal complexities. We've even talked about like how this affects the families of victims.
Right.
So where do we go from here?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's important to look at global trends.
Right.
You know, we are seeing more and more countries moving away from the death penalty, choosing instead to focus on alternative forms of punishment and rehabilitation.
You know, one of the things I was reading in one of these articles was that over 2/3 of the world's countries have now abolished the death penalty. Wow. Either in law or in practice.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty big shift.
It is a significant shift, and it reflects this growing recognition of the inherent flaws in capital punishment, risk of wrongful convictions, and really just like this fundamental right to life.
But there are still countries like the United States. Where the death penalty is still a very real thing.
It is.
Why is that?
You know, it's a lot of the things we talked about earlier. These arguments for retribution, deterrence still hold sway in certain segments of society.
Yeah, and there's a huge emotional component to this debate, especially for people who have been directly affected by violent crime.
Of course.
And I imagine political considerations probably play a role too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is a really difficult issue for politicians to navigate.
Yeah, especially in places where public opinion is so divided.
Exactly. And then there's the influence of media and popular culture, which often portray the death penalty as this like simple solution to a very complex problem.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about how our own experiences and beliefs shape how we view this.
Right. Yeah.
Like I remember growing up, I always thought the death penalty was like justified for certain crimes.
Yeah.
But like after reading all this and talking to you, I'm just not so sure anymore.
I think that's a really common experience.
Yeah.
The more we learn about the complexities of this issue, the more nuanced our views become.
Right.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
You know, it means we're actually engaging with this topic thoughtfully and critically.
Not just relying on gut reactions or preconceived notions.
So where do you think this debate is headed?
It's hard to say for sure, but I do think the trend is moving towards abolition.
Right.
As more countries recognize the ethical and practical problems with capital punishment, and as these alternative approaches to justice gain traction, I think we're going to see continued momentum in that direction.
But it's going to be a long and difficult process, though, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, there are still people who have really deeply entrenched beliefs
right.
and who support the death penalty.
And they hold a lot of power, too.
Yeah.
You know, this isn't a battle that's going to be won overnight.
Right.
It requires ongoing education advocacy and willingness to have those difficult conversations, even with people who hold opposing views.
It's been a really thought-provoking deep dive.
It has.
And I really appreciate your insights on this.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, this is heavy stuff, but it's important to talk about. Absolutely.
And, you know, I hope our listeners out there learn something.
Yeah.
And maybe, you know, start thinking about this a little bit more deeply.
Absolutely. Go out there and challenge your own assumptions.
Yeah. Have those tough conversations. All right. Well, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.